Welcome once again to the Wrestling with Story podcast. I'm extremely lucky to have an old friend from the comic business joining me today to discuss his lifelong passion for professional wrestling, one which he has gotten to see merge with his career for a series of comics starring AEW stars for DC Comics. He's probably best known for his groundbreaking work on the DC Comics series Midnighter and his runs on Wonder Woman and Martian Manhunter. He's been nominated for Eisners, for Ringos, and the GLAAD Award, and is currently writing Annihilation 2099 for Marvel Comics, Exorcists Never Say Die for Mad Cave, and Scarlet Trade for Magma Comics. I am thrilled to welcome Steve Orlando to the show. Welcome, Steve.
Hell yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Was there anything I missed at all in your introduction? Is there anything that is like earth-shattering about yourself that you want the world to know that you have never before had said?
Oh, man. Well, I did meet Undertaker and Paul Bearer at a Syracuse toy convention in like the first year after he debuted. So like the early as the Undertaker, it's the early 1990s, which I don't usually mention. As far as stuff, I mean, I've been orbiting, I'm actually, you said lifelong. It's funny. I actually took like 10 to 15 years off. But as a comic guy, like many of us, like Sting was my guy when I was younger. And so I actually owe getting back into wrestling, both to my friend Mike Kingston, who does Headlock, the wrestling comic, but also to complete happenstance. When I was leaving Emerald City Comic Con in 2015, walked into a hotel that was not even mine, but I knew had Korean chicken wings. And sure enough, by absolute coincidence, Sting and Triple H at Mania 31 was on a giant screen, and I just had to sit down and watch it. So I've been in since then. I guess it's coming up in 10 years, but it was actually complete chance. Before that, I would just go to dinner or lunch with Kingston, and I would just be that asshole being like, "Oh, is the Undertaker still alive? What's that guy doing?" So.
And the correct answer is no, because he is still undead.
Yes, that's fair enough. So yeah, otherwise, I don't know. I wrote an X-Men comic with Nyla Rose. I have, there's a whole TED talk about how wrestlers are some of my best work with when it comes to comics, because they already get it in nearly every way. But yeah, no, I'm deep in it now because like many people in comics and many people, orbiting, I don't have interest. I have obsessions. So as soon as I sort of dip my toe back in, I had the network and I was catching up in the intervening 10 years, at minimum, probably 15. I think I don't really remember much after like 2000. I don't remember Stone Cold's last match. So I don't really know the year, but I feel like I get out between like 2000 or 2001. Although I do remember Beaver Cleavage. So if you can tell me when that is.
I had the same experience because, when I tell my wrestling story, I watched it religiously from the time I was a little kid, up until probably about 2002. And, I'd moved out to LA and I had started working production jobs, and the combination of like working production, TV production, and writing comic books and trying to break into TV and doing all that stuff. Like I was just working 20-hour days and there was so much wrestling on. It was sort of a choice between like have a career or watch wrestling. And so I also like, I drifted out of it for a long time. And I haven't been watching it. I didn't get back into it quite as long ago as you did. I got back into it probably about 3 years ago now, where I've been like super religious about watching it. But like you, and, again, I think that's actually a really astute way of putting it. There is something about comic book fans that make us all obsessives. And it's interesting. One of the things that I found really remarkable doing this and like having done this now for the past couple months is just how similar comic book fans are to wrestling fans, right? Like there is an obsessional nature between like having like uncontrollable knowledge, like literally like the knowledge is just bursting out of your head, which is true of every comic book fan. I mean, how many panels have you been on where you just get accosted by the fans in the in the audience with their questions about continuity.
Well, yeah, I think when you're, I reference Al Snow's interview about familiarity breeding contempt, and folks knowing enough to think they know, but actually having no idea. So I would argue that, yeah, there's a version of knowledge, but there's a gulf in between, which is kind of why I try not to act like I know about wrestling when I meet wrestlers, because I'm sure for all my readings on the internet, I have about as much idea of how things work as folks, have an idea how things work in Marvel or DC, to be honest. So, but I will say that it's kind of much like how I used to be I was a Winded Spirit salesman before I made it in comics. And I actually really love not knowing at all about wrestling, in the same way that, like, I'm into cigars, and I actually really enjoy the freedom of not knowing shit about cigars, and like going into a store and having someone guide me through it, and share their knowledge. So, yeah, no, I mean, like, it is very similar, and I think it's similar in positive, well, I should say in dynamic ways. I recently had an editor refer to groups of critics as smarks to me, and I kind of get it. I mean, like, folks, they want to be part of it. I want to be part of it, but at the same time, there's an experiential type of knowledge that we can have when we're just fans or reading and things like that. I actually think that sort of maintains the mystery, as long as it remains a positive thing. I don't always want to know how the sausage is made. But yes, I would say that we're similar in all the positive ways and perhaps some of the challenging ways.
Did you always want to tell stories? Like, was that from the time you were a kid? Did you want to write and like, was it always focused on comic books, or like, where did that passion for storytelling come from?
I'm be honest, I started trying to go to conventions and breaking it earlier than some. My first comic convention where I thought I was going to get work was when I was 12 years old. I did not, by the way, but I was sure
It wouldn't be unheard of. I mean, there have
well,
been,
that's the thing, right?
surprisingly.
I was like, oh, fuck, I'm going to be the next Jim Shooter. I'm going to be the next Paul Levitz. It's probably better that I'm the first me, in a lot of respects. But I was sure, I went to DC. I went to the DC headquarters in the 90s. That was 1997 when I was 12. And I asked to meet Grant Morrison, and they were like, "You're stupid. He's in Scotland. This is New York." So I didn't really know much, but again, everybody's got to start somewhere. So, yeah, I mean, from pretty early on, this is what I wanted to do. I didn't know if it was writing. I drew a lot as a kid. But it was actually, of all things, an article in the Syracuse New Times, or maybe the Syracuse Post-Standard for aficionados of upstate New York newspapers, about how Superman was getting new powers in a new suit, and he was never going to be the same again, of course. And there was like a roundtable discussion with the folks that had put him together and created Electric Blue Superman. And as they talked about their different roles, it just seemed apparent to me that writing was the first baton holder in this story, in the case of making a comic, and that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to be the spark that kicks off the rest of production and gets the story going. So I thought I was maybe going to be an artist or a cover artist. I have countless paintings where I aspired to be like Alex Ross that were definitely just like finger paintings in retrospect. But upon reading about Electric Blue Superman, I realized that the writing side was kind of where I wanted to be. And that's where I started going to cons, meeting the people that would end up being the folks that mentored me for anywhere between 15 and 20 years, people that still help me and talk to me today about the business. But I did, I spent almost 2 decades bringing in pitches, getting them, getting critique, getting them rejected, finding out what could be better. And I try to say that as often as possible, because folks often think if it doesn't happen in a couple of years, it's not going to happen. But it can, it's a common adage for folks on the comic side. If you're a visual artist, that you got to draw 1,000 bad pages before you draw a good one. And to be frank, I think there's no reason it shouldn't apply to writing as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be 1,000, but there's going to be a lot of bad pitches before there's a good one. And I'm here to say, as I talk on this podcast, we probably know each other because of comics, that it can happen. So you just can't, I didn't quit. I thought I was quitting 1,000 times, but my own, Steve Siegel, who taught me how to write, knew that motivating me meant saying, well, if it's really hard, Steve, you could just quit. And then I would get pissed off and be like, fuck you, old man. And I was good for another 6 months. So, yeah, it's always kind of been the goal. It's always been comics because, to be honest, and this is a relatively recent development, I do just kind of, I mean, I do comics outside of superheroes. I just did a book with someone who's always in talks for the Nobel Peace Prize. But I had this moment recently where I realized I'm unashamed to say that I do just fucking love capes and I love superheroes too. It's not all I love, but I have, since long, long ago, probably since, I think the first comic I ever bought was in 1987. And by bought, I mean my parents gave me. Because my father sold sports memorabilia.
Mm-hmm.
I was not a fan of most sports. So at these shows, I would, in card shows and things, I would always grab comic books and non-sports cards. So if it wasn't comics, I was going to probably be writing for the television show Alf. That doesn't exist anymore. So I would say I made the right choice.
I have a good friend who actually brought Alf back. He was the guy who ran, I don't know if you remember, there was an Alf talk show.
Shit, I'm going to have to retire that joke now, but...
I know. So he eventually ran the Colbert Show. So there was actually a career path that went straight through Alf that could have been yours, and you blew it.
Is this Paul? I forget his last name.
Opus. It was actually Opus Moreski.
Right.
I went to college. He and I went to college together. I remember the day he got that job. He was like, I finally got a job. Like, I'm so happy for you. He's like, yeah, don't be. It's Alf. I'm like,
I mean,
well, listen.
Before anyone knew who I was, I wrote an issue of Femforce for AC Comics. So we've all taken some interesting gigs. I will never say what number that is because the cover is challenging. As you might imagine. But
did you watch wrestling as a kid as well? I take it.
Yeah, so I watched. My great aunt, who was older, as you might imagine, was a big fan. And then my great grandmother was also a big fan. And it's worth noting because they were fans in the era of like Bobo Brazil and Bruno Sammartino and things like that, when these were real. I mean, not to say that people like Hogan weren't cultural icons, but I don't think there'll ever be someone like Bruno again. So they were big fans. It's when I bonded with my great aunt over. So I was watching probably in the late 80s, early 90s. I also, by weird coincidence, my babysitter in the early 90s had a VHS tape. I was pretty young. Had a VHS tape of what I assume was a SummerSlam or In Your House. All I know is they were repeatedly, it was right after Sean turned on Marty. And because they were kept cutting back to the barbershop like betrayal. But I mean, I was young enough that I don't even remember even what happened on that pay-per-view. Young enough that I thought it was a different pay-per-view every time we watched it, but it was the same exact one. For timing, I can tell you they also had a cassette tape of Bette Midler's From a Distance that they played a lot.
Sure.
So I was in, and then I was in and out. I got to meet Undertaker. I would see people when they came to Syracuse. But then, of course, once the Attitude Era hit, I was pretty deeply in. Between that and Sting being a superhero, I'd like mid to late 90s. I was deep in it. But it was, to talk about the counterpoint or the comics of it all. When I was younger, it was always the comic book type characters. It was Sting in WCW. And it was Kane actually in WWE or WWF then because of the story, because he was wronged by the Undertaker. I mean, it's foolish to think now, but like to me, Kane was like a mega face when I was a kid. I was a weirdo, and he had to cover his face up, and of course his brother was essentially his bully. It's wild to think that Undertaker was the face in that scenario. It's like rooting for the Mountain instead of the Hound when you really think about it. Right. And so I really, I really sympathized or I empathized with him, and I was big into Kane. I was pissed when he, was only world champion for a couple days. I was pissed that he never really got put over by Taker too much, because he was like a mega face to me, the weirdo who had been wronged and had come back from revenge. So I followed him, again, probably right through until early 2000 when I don't know exactly when he took his mask off. but I don't think he took his mask off in the era when I was watching. I remember him. I remember his first words being "suck it."
Yeah,
Uh,
with the thing on his throat. Yeah, yeah. Vince,
but
Vince, the stay classy as always, Vince McMahon. He really, even before we knew how terrible Vince was, there was always clues.
yeah. So yeah, but it was always those types of characters, and that's how I approached all sports and performance athletics as well too. I mean, I like the Minnesota Vikings purely because I thought Vikings could kick the ass of any other, which was tough because we were a Bills family actually, but we got over it.
That's funny, like I never had interest because I grew up in Pittsburgh, which is like the sports city, right? Like in Boston, and then I went to college in Boston. So like I learned
Right now, actually.
I'm very jealous. I miss Boston greatly. But like two of the like great sports cities in this country, and I have like zero affinity for any sport whatsoever. Like I could care less about sports. And the thing about them is that because neither of them have plot, so to speak, right? And because essentially the plot resets every year and there aren't like long-term storytelling that like hooked me, so I could never really get into them. What wrestling had for it, and what I always sort of like, what I found in wrestling that drew me into it was the comic book aspect, was that it was essentially like back then when we didn't have comic book movies, it was a comic book TV show that we got to watch every single week.
I mean, Josh didn't have comic book movies. You're acting like, what can I pull out of my ass? Meteor Man and the 1991 Captain America don't exist.
I am slightly older than you, though. Don't forget. So
you're acting like, pardon me, you're acting like the Reb Brown Captain America doesn't exist.
There you go. That's better. That's more like it. Thank you for that. Yeah, I am acting like the Roger Corman Fantastic Four movie.
I was just talking about that at GalaxyCon over the weekend. I'll go to bet and say that I still think that's the best thing makeup we've ever gotten, which is impressive.
It's pretty good. It does look pretty great. I mean, it's fleshy and real, and it's upsetting, which is what it should be.
If you want to talk about Carney backstories, I think I have that. I think I have that and the live action Justice League pilot from like a tape trading, like a VHS bootleg trading show I went to.
I had the benefit. The other like Pittsburgh is like the huge part of my origin story because it's it's where George Romero comes from, and Romero had built this like entire. For those who don't know who are listening, George Romero is Night of the Living Dead, and he built this entire sort of like little junior film industry in Pittsburgh. And part of that was that there were lots of like little film schools and little like not college style film education, industries. And so like I got to spend a lot of time going to different schools and classes and stores. And so I had this amazing education of bootleg tape trading, of just watching garbage like that stuff. So all these like unofficial things that just shouldn't exist, that I certainly should not have seen, including like all the video nasty horror movies that were, things that just were never released in the US that never made it over, or things that had been banned. All that stuff was sort of like a big part of my youth, and like certainly getting to see the Corman Fantastic Four movie was a big part of that, where I was like, this is about as good as we're gonna get. I can't imagine they're ever gonna do better than this. And frankly, have they? Yeah, have they really?
We both did that at the same time. I mean, the only one I never saw that I knew existed that I never saw until I never saw the live action Captain Marvel show that Alex Ross was obsessed with until I was an adult, and it is extremely trite.
It is very trite. That is a good word.
There's some cross. I never saw the live action Doctor Strange thing. I think I have it bookmarked on Amazon Prime. And I think, and Wizard back in the day, I mean, it's fanciful to think of now when they did all their fan casting, like articles and things. But they did like a live action, like collection, like montage, and it had a bunch of characters. I think that like there was a live action, it wasn't Challenge of the Super Friends. Maybe it's called Challenge of the Superheroes. It had like a live action.
Challenge of the Superheroes. Yep.
I do need to watch that eventually.
It's a roast. They're essentially, it feels like a Friars Club roast of superheroes, with all the supervillains. It is spectacular television.
I'm gonna put
And by spectacular television, I mean really terrible, but wonderful at the same time.
Put it next
It's
to the
like,
Star Wars Holiday Special where Harvey Korman plays Space Julia Childs.
yes. I mean, it's essentially like watching the Match Game, but with nothing but superheroes. I mean, it's really pretty much as good as it gets.
Right.
Do you now, as a writer, as someone who has this foundation of wrestling storytelling and like having grown up with it sort of in the back of your head, when you're sitting down to do superheroes and thinking about superheroes, like, do you let the storytelling that you've been sort of raised on with with wrestling, do you feel like it influences what you're doing, or do you feel like it's totally separate for you?
No, I actually think that a lot of the companies we work for could benefit from what I would call basic booking logic. Like if you, even if it, even if it's annoyed us sometimes in wrestling, like I know there was a period of time where we all like to shit on Road Dogg for saying wins and losses don't matter, but they do. And it matters because if obviously if look at Brock, right? Like during the period of time when he almost never lost, when he did lose, it meant something. Because he was a murderer, like, and they understood, even Vince understood, despite him being a piece of shit, that you got to build someone up. You actually have to build wins. You have to build a reputation so that when a loss happens, it matters. So that there's, again, I hate using industry terms. It makes me feel like a poser, but like, you got to put heat on someone. And I honestly, Josh, I think a lot of the places we work would benefit to think about that. I think sometimes folks feel that if a character has a big moment, they're kind of set for life, right? The example I bring up a lot is Mongol. Mongol did for the Man Who Has Everything, and that was massive. Superman had essentially never been that angry before, for all intents and purposes.
Right.
And the first time he came back, it was like, holy fuck, like this dude is back. But now, 20 years, 15 years later, I mean, he's gotten his ass kicked. His daughter's gotten his ass kicked. His son's gotten his ass kicked. Like, just bringing back Mongol because he did something 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and who knows, 2 years ago in comics time, it doesn't mean what it did. Same with a character like the Anti-Monitor, who, again, listen, I love Sinestro Corps War. I was still, I was still functioning as a reader back then. And yeah, like I was like shitting when he showed up in that first splash because he had not shown up in whatever 25 years, and the last time he did, he destroyed the entire fucking universe. But now, of course, he's gotten his ass kicked a variety of times, and so it just doesn't mean as much, both when he comes back and when folks beat him. So yeah, I actually think that we could benefit in superhero storytelling from just a little more wrestling, stuff like that applies to basic stakes, not necessarily the top line stuff. We don't need all the gonzo like fucking Mae Young giving birth to a hand, whatever the fuck else.
Strong disagree.
Yeah, we don't. Well, in the right book, I mean, like I think Garth Ennis has that locked down, that entire genre. So, and he's doing,
unfairly for the rest of us. You might be right.
But like, I do think that's sort of the idea of stakes and how you build stakes and how you heat up a heel or heat up a villain. There's really no shortcut for it. So I do think we could benefit thinking about that a lot more.
And I also, one of the other things that really comes to mind is, villains tend to be treated, and this is actually especially true in the movies, because the movies are built around, especially like if you look at how the Marvel movies have been built, because they're built around the heroes and not the villains are disposable. And because the villains are disposable, they have no real stakes built in to them. In wrestling, one of the most important things is that the villains have to move on, right? Like the villains have to be able to continue on to their next feud, and they have to have legs. And so because of that, the villains have to have purpose and they have to have dimensionality to them. If you took that logic to them, that's how you get the best example, like who is the one Marvel villain who matters? It was Thanos, because Thanos was a wrestling villain, right? Thanos had a rationale for what he was doing. He had like he had an ethos that made sense. He had like an entire backstory. He had supporting characters. He had everything around him that made him into a full-fledged character rather than just being the guy who's coming in from an outside territory to pop in and then pop out again. Whereas everybody else is booked in this very, like, everyone else is booked, so to speak, in the movies as though they're just sort of like just popping in for their movie and then they're going to disappear. I think a lot about, because I'm a giant MJF mark. Like, I love MJF to death. And I think part of why that guy is so special is that he coexists. Like, even when they had him as a face, as a baby face, he was still the same guy. They didn't actually change him. The shitheel character that he was still sort of existed. So that now that he's back to being himself, so to speak, that's all still there. That's really like rich, good, strong storytelling, character-based storytelling. And if you bring that level of storytelling and you bring that kind of villain in, you get something more for it. I mean, even if you look outside of, superhero movies, you look at something like, the Fast and the Furious movies, to use just
those are superhero
franchise.
Those are superhero.
They are superhero movies, right? And they also have they have a similar problem, which is that the villains are very like, they sort of are just like, here, now there's a villain. And then I guess they're a good guy now because they're a big enough star that we want to bring them back. But there's not a lot of, like, for the most part, the villains don't have any real heft to them. So, like, for me, like, when I'm looking at whether I'm writing in genre or outside of genre, like, I actually do try to kind of look at how to write these characters with the mentality of how do I make them more than just the, like, simple logic of how do I make them the hero of the story. It's how do I make them an actual person. And there's something to this idea, I think, about wrestlers having to kind of coexist with their reality, that they are an actual person, that they are like an actual fleshy, genuine being who's playing a character while being the character, while having to, like, walk around in the world at the same time, that I think almost forces you to have to write them in a different way. And if you bring that logic in so that they're not just sort of flitting in and out of the story, I think you get more out of it. Like, I think that's the benefit. Like, that's, to me at least, that's one of the things that I'm taking from wrestling into my day-to-day writing.
I mean, I will actually say it's interesting that you say that. Because I've actually without blowing up this podcast, I've actually spent the last 3 weeks complaining about the opposite. I think you noted I wrote, so at San Diego they debuted these AEW Origin comics. I wrote them.
Yeah.
And I actually, upon getting the gig, I actually pushed, and I think we did a pretty damn good job. I'm proud of what happened. I'm proud of what we did. But upon getting the gig and having the masculine to the Origins, and digging into these characters, I realized that a lot of times I pushed them that instead of origins, they should essentially be thesis statements for who these characters are and what they do. Mm-hmm. Because, it's funny you brought up Thanos. A lot of wrestling characters don't have, I would say, they have character, but they don't have what we would sit down in a room and call it like an inciting incident, or as Kelly Sue DeConnick, much smarter than me, calls it a core wound. Some of them do, right? Darby does. Darby's was very easy to write because he has the car accident,
right?
For example. But a lot of these characters, I find, they are great characters, and you know how they would react. You know how you can smash them up against each other. But I think that sometimes, to be frank, like their motivation is they want to be the champion and good at wrestling. There's or at least those part of the stories don't make it to TV. Even if you want to talk about Max, I agree 100% now. But I don't think that formed really until just after 2020, when he started talking about, to be frank, why he was a scumbag.
Right.
When he debuted, he was doing great heel work, right? But He was doing it because he was an asshole. Like, that was his character. It wasn't until you found out, he gave the ADD promos, he gave the anti-Semitism promos. You kind of found out why he acted this way. So I would actually argue sometimes it's not there in the same way. And it, well, to be fair, I mean, it's great when it is, but it doesn't always need to be, like if you, I will ask, and you might actually have an answer, but if you look at, we'll take two of the quote unquote greatest characters that the industry's given us. I would argue don't have traditional origins. If you look at Flair and Stone Cold, they're indelible characters, but we don't know why Ric Flair is Ric Flair, and we don't know why Stone Cold became Stone Cold. At least to my, as I would view it.
I mean, I think here's what you do get, and this is where this is sort of the thing that I'm talking about, is that with Stone Cold in particular, what you get with Stone Cold is you get the reality of who that guy is, right? You get everything that happened to him as a person mixed into who the character is, right? So to understand Stone Cold as a character, you have to understand Steve Austin, or Steve Williams, I guess technically, right? As a guy, you have to understand that, like, the ECW promos, right? You have to understand that, like, this is a guy who went through WCW and he's incredibly talented and incredibly gifted and worked his ass off, and it didn't matter.
Well, now we're getting into the world. I mean, it's a little, I mean, like, so that's an interesting discussion, because do you, only because that's Steve Williams, the guy. It's that isn't the backstory of Stone Cold, the character. It informed the creation of the character. But I would.
But that's why it's cool. That's why.
100%. But that's metatextual knowledge. I mean, like, so I guess. No, I both agree with you, and the challenge is when you're working, having just done this. If you're working in kayfabe, none of that stuff exists. We know it exists.
Right.
But I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think that's why, at least for me, that's why I get behind a lot of these characters. It's often more because I'm rooting for the performer, the challenge, at least having been through this, is that some of that stuff, it doesn't really exist in kayfabe. And then there's the question of, do they want it to, I mean, there's things that, when we did the origin for, oh shit, that one didn't get put out.
That one really doesn't exist in kayfabe.
But like, what's a good example? Well, yeah, even stuff like we did the Swerve one, and there's, within the bounds of the character Swerve Strickland, we can't talk about what he went through at WWE because that was a different person. Even though we know, of course, that it's the same person. And then we found out we could build in some motivations about his military history and things like that. But no, I mean, so I think you're right. I do think it's challenging at the same time. Because obviously we know that Stone Cold doesn't exist without all those things you're talking about. And I would even argue or wonder though, are we so in it now that are we the average viewer? Do you think that the true, like, the Wednesday Warriors of wrestling, do they know that Stone Cold was stunning Steve Austin? Do they know do they know he was in ECW?
I think as much, like, I think what's happened, and this is a challenge, I think about this all the time as a writer, period. Right? Like, forget making videos about wrestling. Like, this is what I think about, like, when I'm sitting down making, like, we talked about this, making the live action Avatar series, right? You're making stuff for an audience that is so smartened up and has such a heightened awareness of the media landscape, while simultaneously you're forced to make content with an awareness of the least of them. Not meant in an insulting way, but meant in sort of like an attention way, right? So there's this whole thing.
The casual wrestling fan, if you will. Sometimes,
Well, that's the thing, right?
sometimes
Like
thought of as a mythical beast, but they're out there.
so like, and I think about it again, like not to use the Marvel movies, like, you watch something, you have the same audience that saw like the Eternals and was like, what the flying fuck is this? Like, what am I watching? Is the same audience that flocked to see Deadpool and Wolverine this weekend. And like, Eternals was positively digestible compared to Deadpool and Wolverine, right? Like, Deadpool and Wolverine is nothing but inside jokes.
I have
Like,
not seen it, but I have no problem assuming and understanding that that's what it is.
yeah, like, I mean, it is. I mean,
As
there's
creators of comics, we are eminently familiar with what Deadpool is. Maybe too much.
I mean, there's cameos from characters that were rumored to be in movies. Like, that's how deep it goes, as opposed to Eternals, which is like everything that you need to know about the movie is actually in the movie. Like, there's nothing not in the movie that's not in the movie, but people were still sort of like turned off by it. And what it really comes
Do you
down
think
to,
it's there for dudes to eagerly explain all these things to their very patient spouses, or
my wife is not patient. I can tell you that.
I'm
My
lucky
wife's
that
very not patient for it.
I'm lucky that my fiance is very into sci-fi and Star Trek, despite him not being like a comics guy when we met. So it's adjacent enough, right, that I could sit here and be like, well, the Eternals and Jack Kirby, and then like, but I do often wonder. I years ago. Here's a digression. Years ago, my ex was deeply into Amanda Palmer, which is problematic because I mean, if listeners like her, that's great. I will be diplomatic and say her work is not for me. And so she was coming to Albany where I used to live. And I said, relationships are about compromise. So let's go. I'm sure that I will find it insufferable, but that's fine. And of course we sit down, and as it happens, the show is on Neil Gaiman's birthday. So he's there. And behind us as we get ready for the show is exactly what we're talking about. It is this dude who is very obviously on a date, and he thinks that explaining Sandman in just the most laborious detail is going to get him laid. And I assume it didn't. I assume
I think it's a fair assumption.
I mean, now this was a cursed concert anyway. I will do the quick version, but it was also like 2 days after the 2016 election, so everybody was very morose. And so she comes out with her fucking like foraged band that she has, and says,
they don't even know they're not getting paid yet. They haven't found out.
Exactly. Well, that's why she just finds them where she can. And she's like, well, it's been a hard 2 days for everybody. And so if at any point during this concert, life becomes too much for you, you can just shout out the safe word. And the safe word is Goodnight Moon, which is 2 words, but I was not going to correct her. And so if you say Goodnight Moon, I will stop this concert and I'll read to you the book Goodnight Moon. I told my ex if it happened more than twice, I was walking out. So she played like the Jeep song, and immediately people start bawling. And sure enough, some fucking chode yells Goodnight Moon, and she stops, and we go through one. We go through another, someone else howling. And then for whatever reason, at some point, I mean, not for whatever reason, for a very clear reason, someone interrupts the concert again, but not to yell Goodnight Moon, but to yell out that Leonard Cohen has died. And so at this point, because they were extremely good friends, potentially in Amanda's mind, she just like collapsed on the floor like one of those dolls, from when we were younger, where you press the bottom and yeah. So, and that, of course, this gaggle of theater kids, there's just howling Goodnight Moon and around, but she can't speak because she's so overwhelmed with emotion. So who do you think gets up and reads fucking Goodnight Moon?
Oof.
But Neil Gaiman. At which point I did walk out. I was just like, I cannot do this. And the punchline to that is that, like, of course, 2 or 3 weeks later, she said, because at the concert, she was like, Trump is going to be bad, but the art, think of the art. And then within a month, they said, well, think of the art, but we're moving to Australia.
Yeah.
And people were dunking on them. And someone on Twitter said, oh, look, I found the set list from the worst concert in history. And upon reading it online, the screen cap, it was from that fucking concert in Albany. But anyway, yeah, no, but so to that point, like I do, yes, I think I mean, and I do that with wrestling too, to bring it around. Like I almost can't help myself because I think for folks who are not deep in it, it gives them more of a reason to care. Like my fiance, well, it's notable that he likes nearly all, like he responds more to character than work rate. And that's actually fascinating perspective to me because we're in it, and there'll be someone I like, I don't know who's like an insider. I think you have to be something of like a deep wrestling fan to like Suzuki, for example.
Sure.
And it's because he comes out and I'm like, oh yeah, it's the Murder Grandpa, and Mike is like, it's an old Japanese man. Why are we?
Who slaps people?
And so he doesn't like Danielson, which is hilarious because I also have never really gotten Danielson. But what he fucking does love is shit like Tony Storm, shit like OC.
Sure.
Like he responds to the character, and then when he does, outside of that, I usually end up telling him stuff like this because that's what makes him care. He cares about the stuff we're talking about that may or may not be officially parts of the story. What it took for them to get on TV. Or like what they did before, what they sacrificed. He doesn't care about Becky Lynch, the character, but he probably does care about like Rebecca Quinn, the person who like went to clown school and like started learning
And wanted this more than anything in the world,
Yeah.
and like it's all she's ever wanted was to be
Exactly.
little McFoley. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I met I was hanging out at the DC booth when they had the signing for your comic book. So I got to meet everybody in lieu of you. So in your stead, I
I
went
still did
and met all
Jason
the
Aaron.
players.
He was convinced that Britt thought that he was me.
That's
Um,
really funny.
and for folks who don't know, Jason Aaron and I, he's a good friend, and we look exactly alike, so it's easy.
Identical. I could definitely see how there's no way you could ever not get you confused.
Absolutely.
But then when I met Swerve, all I could think to say to him was like, "I'm just so happy that you're successful now." And he was like, "What the fuck does that mean?" And I was like, "Just like you really deserve it. Like you've done so much to get where you are, and it's so nice." And he was like, "Uh-huh, great." That's all I could think of, man. I'm sorry. That's just all I have for you. Whereas Tony Storm, I was so effusive because I'm like in love with like the story that she's been doing the past 6 months has just been so good. The past year, I guess, has been so goddamn amazing. And she's just like, I think Tony Storm is actually the perfect blend of story and work rate. Like she's amazing in the ring and she does such great work, while simultaneously like the character stuff has just been astonishing.
So she is great. I do think that is it the Mandela effect when you're like sure something happened that didn't happen?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just have to say this because it's a wrestling podcast, and please correct me. So I do also really love Tony, but I swear to fucking God, in the Mae Young Classic, Storm Zero was a different move, and it was like the Tiger Driver, and it became a pile driver. But I've never been able to.
I don't remember.
In my mind, this has happened twice in my life. Once is with, and neither were with fucking the actual Nelson Mandela, but like. I'm convinced, I swear that Storm Zero was like a Tiger Driver styled move. And I found out what happened with this. When I was a kid, I was convinced that Maverick's powers were to see like 5 to 10 seconds in the future, not that the power redirecting thing that he does.
Right.
And it's because it was in one fucking trading card where that was his power. So I'm not crazy in that respect, but I'm still convinced that Storm Zero wasn't always a pile driver. And it doesn't matter, by the way. She is great, as you said. But every time I'm a pile driver and they say Storm Zero, I become Grandpa Simpson at a town meeting,
That's not my Storm. That's not my Storm Zero.
But I'll never know. I'll never fucking know.
So are you an AEW guy or a WWE guy? I feel like I feel like I always have to ask because everybody is insane.
Well, I'm not. So that's funny. Do you find when you have comic creators on that they really have an answer? Because I will admit,
you do.
Oh well, I don't. I mean, it's not a cop out. It varies on how one is doing. Because I also don't buy into the DC versus Marvel rivalry.
Yeah.
I tend to think that that's for. I mean, folks. I mean, now someone will disagree with me, but like folks tend to think that we all are like chopping at the bit and hate each other. But I I'm convinced that maybe back in the day, some of the publishers and presidents maybe really hated each other, but we're all just doing a job here.
I always say that the difference between when people used to say to me when I worked at DC, and everyone would always give me shit like, "Oh, I bet you wish you worked at Marvel." All I could think is like, "Well, yeah, because working at DC was a nightmare back then." So that was really. It's not because I liked the characters more or less. It was because Dan DiDio hated me and tried to destroy me. That was really my primary reason for not wanting to work at DC.
It's a valid reason. But I will say that outside of like the week to week, month to the month, I think that like on a storytelling sense right now, like if you ask me literally right now, I think WWE is doing better. I think that their stuff makes more sense. And at the same time, in my heart, I like the vibe of AEW more. Like to me, I think the AEW experience is kind of like a high budget version of going to an indie wrestling show. And that's what actually makes me love wrestling. I don't ever really want to go to WrestleMania and sit in the only seat I can afford and see like tiny ant people wrestling. I like going to like Beyond, which runs in Boston or actually in Worcester, where like, yeah, you're in like it runs in a Polish cultural home and there's like 500 people there and you can get right into it and you can participate. Yeah. So I think for the most part, AEW maintains that feel, which is actually kind of impressive because it is still big budget. And so like, yeah, if pressed, if I had to like toot and boot them, I would definitely boot WWE to make it about RuPaul's Drag Race as well. But that's vibes. That's vibes, man. It's all vibes. And if I had to pick, otherwise it's like a case by case basis. I do think they're sort of finding their way and refocusing right now in AEW, even though I root for them much more. I mean, WWE doesn't need my rooting. They're going to be fine. But at the same time, it feels lately like they could use more focus, especially on mid-card stories. I mean, I think they're cooking with Tony and Mariah. I mean, and I could pick out other things as I think about it. Even though I love Swerve and Danielson, I think because Danielson has been injured, like there actually hasn't. The match will be great, but where is the build? If I'm being honest.
Yeah.
But listen, that could change in a minute, right? Like I loved when Max was champion, and I think that a lot of it's just about character chemistry. I mean, I would watch Max and Joe. Well, folks need to know that Samoa Joe is my favorite wrestler. So, I mean, I would watch Joe have a fucking feud with, Damian Demento, from 1991. I think Joe is the opposite of a cooler. He's a heater. I think
he does make everybody look great.
And the second, I judge by the moments I remember. And I was actually I was texting with Jason Aaron earlier today. Like, I remember character stuff. I almost wish that AEW would pull back on work rate stuff a little bit because it becomes so much that you're a little desensitized to it. If every week is a 4.5, 5-star match, well, then that's kind of the standard. So how do you raise above the standard? Versus like, I could picture right now, I don't remember what show it was at. Maybe it was All In. But I can picture right now that moment where Joe just pushed Max off the stage. And I was like, and it was so exciting to me because it was just like, it was on and they sold it so well. I mean, I loved their feud. But I will also say though, I think AEW has a better diversity of styles. I was just talking to someone this past weekend, talk about the two versions of me. Young Steve was very bored by Jeff Jarrett in the 90s and early 2000s.
Sure.
Now I actually am excited every time he is on because he's maintained he can still work, and all the stuff that everybody was doing in the late 90s, like what I would call like the classic wrestling gags in a lot of ways, nobody's doing it now. So it all feels fresh to me, like I mean, when he ripped his shirt off and had the ref shirt underneath at the end of the Owen a couple weeks ago, and that was like every weekend back in like the new era days. Or the new, whatever they called it, the Dino Bravo, and pre that. But now I think all his stuff stands out because everybody's doing 1,000 super kicks and they're doing whatever, and there's nothing wrong with that, but he feels unique now. It feels fresh. I mean, one of my favorite Orange Cassidy title defenses was against Jeff Jarrett. Because the storytelling.
That was a good match. Yeah, that was a good match.
You know, so again, if I had to pick, I would say AEW, but we're also lucky that we don't have to pick, for the moment at least. And I think they're going to tighten it back up. I'm very excited for All In. Like, crowd reaction to me is a big part of wrestling. So, if people are loud, it's one of the reasons I'm more excited for the international WWE shows, because I just know people are going to be losing their minds and very enthusiastic and very engaged. That to me feels like a scaled up version of the indie show. And that's, I guess, what I'm looking for.
It's actually interesting. I find it sort of fascinating how those international shows have sort of screwed up WWE, because now when you watch the weekly shows, it's so noticeable when the audience isn't into it. Whereas normally you're just sort of like, well, it's just a regular Raw audience. Every time they go away and do a show out of the country and you see that audience going berserk, and then they come back and do a regular show, you're like, man, there's something wrong with the crowd. I don't know what's going on. And
Oh yeah, I mean,
it's because they were just out of the country. That's why.
I mean, Backlash in Puerto Rico, probably one of my favorite WWE pay-per-views since I've been watching. And because I'm a weirdo, like, yes, the match is great, but I will sometimes just like, again, I love a great debut. I'm half in it for the entrances, perhaps because I'm a weirdo, but like Bad Bunny coming out and people just losing their fucking minds, is so great to me. I probably haven't felt like that in WWE since Nakamura debuted in NXT, which was also amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, right down to him waking at the hard camera, which, for folks who know, anyone who references the hard camera to me, yes, it breaks kayfabe, but I also will always love it. I will always love the way I like. Maybe I should write Deadpool if I love breaking the fourth wall. I don't know, but I will always love that.
Feels like a poison pill to write Deadpool right now. Feels like there's a lot of eyes on that book, and the only fun way to write Deadpool is when there's nobody paying attention to it.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like fate though, since the other guy that told me how to write comics was Joe Kelly. I feel like it's going to be happening at some point. But yeah, it's a high stress time for sure. But then again, Josh, I'm the writer of Scarlet Witch, so I'm very familiar with. Your laughter tells me you understand, so I won't even go
on. All right, as we wrap up, so if you were to direct people to your work, other than the stuff I talked about at the top, what are you most excited about that you're working on? What do you want people to check out?
No, right on. Well, everybody, last November I put out a book with Jose Andres, who does incredible work worldwide, feeding people after natural disasters, man-made disasters, in war zones. He's about as close to a real superhero as exists in the world. And we did disaster relief together. And then for 5 years, we were writing this book, Feeding Dangerously, which came out last year in November. So I have to bring it up because, I mean, it's probably the most, well, important is a douchebag word, but it's probably the most passionate I've been about a book ever. I've never put 5 years of my life into a book. Alberto Ponticelli drew the whole thing. It's one of the first of its kind documentary graphic novels. And above all that, when you buy a copy, a donation is made to World Central Kitchen, who are, to be frank, as we record this, putting their lives on the line to feed people who've lost everything. So that's got to be what I push, because it's unquestionably the thing that I'm most proud of in the industry.
Well, that's fantastic. Absolutely. And I will make sure we get links to all of your work, to your website, to your Twex, whatever we call it now.
In the words of Nyla Rose's amazing, now that she's a face, promo for a couple of weeks ago, I ain't calling it X. Not on Nyla Rose's Twitter, not on Beyonce's internet. I will never call it X.
Mm-hmm. So. Fair enough. Thank you so much for hanging out. I really appreciate it. It's been great having you. Check out everything from Steve Orlando. There are so many cool comics. I'm so glad that you're doing so many creator-owned books right now. It's a great time to be doing creator-owned, and like that you're doing so many, and you're doing so many from so many super cool like indie publishers who are just great people. Like, it's really nice to see that there's so many indie publishers again. It's been so long. Like, it felt like there was a big contraction a few years back, and so it's nice to see there's so many people, just like good people from those few publishers back then, have all spread their wings and started making great books again. It's really exciting.
No, hell yeah. I mean, that is a great place for me to shout out that I'm a Mad Cave evangelist. So thank you for bringing that up. But so if folks are looking, There will be, as you noted, there'll be an original from me next year for Mad Cave, even though I'm on Gotcha Man now. So, but it is a great time. I mean, look, this is 10 years for me in the business this year. And so it is interesting to see who is still around, who's on the come up, and who's been and who's going to come up next. I'm most interested.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve. I appreciate it. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back later this week with coverage for SummerSlam, as always. And then we, of course, do our live streams every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, covering Raw, Dynamite, and, of course, SmackDown. You can follow us on YouTube at Wrestling with Story. You can follow us on Instagram at Wrestling with Story. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh Fialkov. And if you have questions, or if you have guest suggestions or anything you want to ask me, you can drop me a line at my email, which is josh@wrestlingwithstory.com. I'm available anytime you need me. If you have any questions for me, anything you want, go ahead and drop me a line. Thank you so much for listening. And of course, we'll see you next time, and wrestling forever.